Sherry, good morning and welcome. We're happy you could join us today to hear Dr. Susie Raiford talk to us about administering the WASI, the WISC, and the WAIS remotely. We have some panel members with us today who will ask Susie some questions so that we can discuss this. And so I just want to introduce the panel members and then let them kick it off. Our first panel member is Pat Moran, then Lindsay Simas, Kathleen Woodward, Maggie Kjer, and Liz Gross, and then myself. And we are happy to have you all here. So I'm going to turn this over to Pat Moran to ask the first question of Dr. Raiford.
Dr. Raiford, we'll start with the WAIS, so the WAIS-IV. So specifically is what can I do if I can't administer block design? And in your answer, if you could talk to us about what this battery would look like and what scores can I obtain?
Sure, be happy to do that. Okay, so if you would like to administer the WAIS-IV, but you're unable to administer block design, then obviously with the full administration, if you had it, you could get all of the composite scores that are listed in the second column there. Well, in the first column, they're listed and then checked off in the second column under full administration. But we're going to be focusing on that third column that says no block design. So if you read down the column, you can see what you could do to get each one of the composite scores or what adjustments need to be made. So in this situation, you would give all of your core 9 subtests other than block design. That's similarities, vocabulary, information, visual puzzles, matrix reasoning, digit span, arithmetic, coding, and symbol search. Then you would choose to give either figure weights or picture completion instead of block design, or you could prorate some of your scores. So here you're going to get the FSIQ and the General Ability Index if you wish, along with all of the 4 index scores. So if you read down the column, you can see the method used for each one. So the Verbal Comprehension Index you would get as usual. The Perceptual Reasoning Index, you would be substituting figure weights or picture completion for block design or prorating. And then Working Memory and Processing Speed as usual. The Full Scale IQ, you would be substituting either figure weights or picture completion for block design or prorating. And then for the General Ability Index, you can also substitute figure weights or picture completion for block design.
Thank you. So, do you want to say more? So the next question I had to follow up is, what can I do if I can't use block design or response booklets? So what would that battery look like and what scores can I obtain?
Okay, so we're getting that question a lot because it's tough if you are trying to do it without block design or response booklets. So people are curious about what scores they'd be able to obtain in that situation. So if you look in this time, we're going to be focusing in the last column where it says no block design or response booklets. As you can see, you can still get the Verbal Comprehension Index and you can still get the Perceptual Reasoning Index by the same method that we discussed in the previous column and the Working Memory Index. But you cannot get a Processing Speed Index if you don't use response booklets. And then in this situation, you cannot get a Full Scale IQ because one of the rules for the Full Scale IQ for calculating it is you have to have at least one subtest on that, that Processing Speed Index, which you wouldn't have if you don't use response booklets. But you could get a General Ability Index if you want to measure general ability. And that's the same method as discussed in the previous situation. You would take figure weights or picture completion and substitute it for block design. So here you'll get, to sum up, you'll get GAI along with 3 index scores.
Thank you.
Yep. So then it looks like we had another question. I'm not sure who had this one.
Yeah, hi, this is Lindsay Simas. I was wondering if you could please explain exactly what materials I would need to administer the WAIS-IV.
Sure. So for either of these situations, you just need the regular WAIS-IV components. But if you're administering for via teleassessment, you would need the digital WAIS-IV stimulus books. Or you could use Q Interactive if you have a WAIS-IV subscription. You would, if you're using the digital WAIS-IV stimulus books that are available on Q Global, the digital assets there, you could also use your paper administration manual, your hardcover administration manual, or the digital administration manual that's available there on Q Global. You would need a record form if you're using the Q Global digital assets, just your regular paper record form as usual, and then a response booklet if you're going to be using it. And that would need to be in the examinee's location. And then you also need, there's a digital asset response booklet that helps you teach the task. Let's say if you're doing coding and you need to fill in those symbols and show them how to do that remotely, you can do it on the digital response booklet. And then you might need the GAI table if you're opting to go with the option where you're not going to calculate the full scale IQ, or if you want the GAI. And that is available in the technical and interpretive manual in Appendix B. So if you're using Q Interactive, however, you don't need all of these things because Q Interactive is really self-contained. So you would just need the response booklet. And that's about it. That would cover it.
Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Raiford. This is Kathleen Woodward, and I'm wondering if I'm administering the WISC-V remotely, what would the battery look like if I cannot administer block design, and what kinds of scores can I obtain?
Great question. So we're also getting this question quite a bit, and part of this relates to the nature of the WISC-V is that all of the index scores have 2 subtests. And so if block design is missing, you wouldn't be able to get a visual spatial index. However, there are other options that you can look at. So let me go on to this next slide here. There is a book that I published in 2017 that has a score called the NonMotor Visual Spatial Index. And it's an alternate index score that you could use in place of the one that was published in the traditional measure. So you could see here in the published WISC-V, it's block design and visual puzzles. But in this alternate index score, it's the non-motor visual spatial index, has a subtest called block design multiple choice. And that's available within the WISC-V Integrated, which is an expanded clinical battery that has some additional subtests to give you more information about your scores on the WISC-V. And in 2017, a number of these non-motor index scores were created, and this would be one potential application. So
thank you. I also am wondering if I'm administering the WISC-V remotely and I can't use block design or response booklets, what would that look like?
Sure. Well, let me go through what composite scores would be available here without block design first. So this is a similar slide to the previous one. You can see that all the composite scores are listed along the first column there. And if you do a full administration, you can get any of those composite scores. However, if you don't have block design, then if you read down that column that we're focusing on first, the red column, the one with the red box around it, you can see that we can get a verbal comprehension index. But then for the visual spatial index, you could replace that with the non-motor visual spatial index and use block design multiple choice instead of block design. You can see the check marks next to the fluid reasoning index, the working memory index, and the processing speed index, because those aren't affected by missing block design. Then for the full scale IQ, you could just substitute visual puzzles for block design because a substitution is allowed. And all of the other ancillary scores there that are listed next, you can obtain those as usual. If you go down to the nonverbal index and the general ability index, though, there are non-motor analogs also for those. And we'll talk about where you can access those scores. Then if you can't use block design or response booklets, let's talk about that scenario. So this slide depicts another alternate score, or this depicts the published full scale IQ. And I'm going to show you another alternate score that you could use in its place, because on the full scale IQ, you only have the ability to substitute or prorate one subtest. So if you're not going to use response booklets or blocks, your score is going to be further affected. So what you could use as an alternative is this non-motor full scale score. And the non-motor full scale score relies also on block design multiple choice rather than block design, which is a subtest on the WISC-V integrated. Then also you can see that in place of coding in the light blue circle, it's naming speed quantity. So here's the regular composite score. This is the non-motor full scale score. And this is available in an essentials book, Essentials of WISC-V Integrated Assessment, this norm, just like the non-motor visual spatial index. And portions of that book, John Wiley and Sons has given us permission to make that available for free to our users. And so that you can go ahead and continue to use the WISC-V and have these alternate composite scores. You'll see that also, in addition to the block design multiple choice, there's naming speed quantity. And there is some free software that's available with the book and that's available for free to our users who are using it there on Q Global. And that book is accompanied by that free software that will convert the naming speed quantity score from a standard score to a scaled score, because it's on a standard score metric. And it'll convert it for you. You can use that software as often as you need it. And you might be wondering why naming speed quantity was chosen to represent processing speed in place of coding. Well, obviously, if you aren't going to use the response booklet, you need something that doesn't use a response booklet. So there were two options. It could be naming speed quantity, or it could be naming speed literacy. That's the other measure of cognitive speed that doesn't involve a response booklet. Each of those involve cognitive speed and visual scanning and associative memory, both coding and naming speed quantity. But on the surface, coding involves visual associative memory encoding and rapidly using newly encoded associations and motor production, whereas naming speed quantity involves auditory visual associative memory and rapid retrieval of frequently used long-term associative memory and expressive responses. Interestingly, both do involve verbal automaticity of retrieval in response to quantitative stimuli. Coding has an auditory visual associative memory component in the numbers, and those who have more strongly automatized the names of the digits have an advantage because they can verbally mediate the task as they fill in the codes. But for naming speed quantity, it's retrieving the names of those digits as well, but in response to an abstract quantitative representation, which is actually likely to be an earlier skill than automaticity of numbers. And if you have walked into any kindergarten classroom recently, you've probably seen tasks like this. They're called subitizing tasks. So they're crucial to acquiring those quantitative representations to early math skills. Relative to naming speed literacy, which was the other choice, naming speed quantity had an advantage because it has reduced language requirements. Additionally, it has clinical sensitivity that's similar to coding for many neurodevelopmental conditions that are commonly assessed with the WISC-V, including intellectual disability, specific learning disorder, ADHD, autism with language impairment and without language impairment, and traumatic brain injury. And naming speed quantity also has a superior G loading relative to naming speed literacy. The data related to this analysis is available in the Essentials book I mentioned, Essentials of WISC-V Integrated Assessment. And it has a higher loading on the processing speed factor than even cancellation. So it has many advantages as a choice there. And I should mention that these are independent norms. These do not involve substitution or proration. These norms were calculated using the Pearson norming method. They meet all of our quality standards, and there's a great deal of validity and reliability and clinical utility evidence for these scores that's provided in that book that's made available for free. So anybody can go check those out. You can see here where we've represented the nonverbal index that's on the published measure. And here's the non-motor nonverbal index, also available in that book. You can see that block design multiple choice is used in place of block design. And then here is the published general ability index and the non-motor general ability index. These are all available for free in that book. The norms tables are in there, or you can use the Excel tool. And all of this is available on your Q Global resource library under the WISC-V Integrated restricted folder. So I'm going to go on to the other scenario that you brought up, which is represented in that last column there. And this is when you don't want to use blocks or response booklets, or you're unable to. So in this scenario, for this, you do the same thing you did as if there were no blocks, but you also administer the 2 naming speed subtests. So then if you read, let's read down the column and kind of look at what's available within this battery and what you can learn. So you get the verbal comprehension index as usual, rather than, and I'm focusing on that red square column there, the last column. For the visual spatial index, you'd replace it with the non-motor visual spatial index, which is available within the book, using block design multiple choice instead of block design, which is a WISC-V integrated subtest. Then the fluid reasoning index and the working memory index can be obtained as usual. Rather than using the processing speed index, you get a measure of cognitive speed by replacing it with the naming speed index. And then rather than the full scale IQ, the non-motor full scale score is available. Just to review that, it uses block design multiple choice and naming speed quantity instead of block design and coding respectively. And then for the nonverbal index, if you needed to obtain that for a particular patient, you could replace it with the non-motor nonverbal index. And that uses block design multiple choice instead of block design. Rather than the general ability index, you can replace that with the non-motor general ability index using block design multiple choice instead of block design. And unfortunately, you're not able to obtain a cognitive proficiency index in this situation. Looks like we have a question about the materials that we need to be able to do this. Whose question was this?
Hi, Susie. This is Anne Marie. Dr. Chair may be having trouble unmuting. That button gets hidden sometimes in this platform. But this was a question that Maggie Kjer was going to ask you.
Okay. So she wanted to know what materials we needed to have.
Yes, please. In order to administer the WISC-V in the ways that you've just been talking about, what materials would you need to have to do that?
Yes. So you may have noticed that block design multiple choice is a critical piece there. So you really need access to that subtest. And in order to get access to that, you need the WISC-V Integrated Stimulus Book 2. Now that is available as a digital stimulus book on Q Global within the Q Global digital assets. And it appears under the WISC-V Integrated restricted folder once it's purchased. You also would need the WISC-V digital stimulus books, or you could administer those subtests on Q Interactive if you have a subscription to Q Interactive as well. If using Q Global, there's a one-page printable record form that can be used for block design multiple choice. So you're not purchasing the entire record form. And I believe that the purchase price is very low. It may be $2 or something, and you can print it as often as you need to so that you can administer block design multiple choice whenever you need to. And it doesn't charge you each time you print it. It's just a one-time purchase. Then if you're using Q Global, the WISC-V Administration and Scoring Manual, which could be a digital version, or it could be your paper version if you're able to have access to that. And then the WISC-V Integrated Administration and Scoring Manual for the purposes of using block design multiple choice. The Essentials of WISC-V Integrated book excerpt, which is free on Q Global, and the Excel tool that goes with it, which is the WISC-V Integrated Q Global Interpretive Assistant. And that's also free. It's unlimited uses. It's just a little Excel file that you can download.
Thank you, Susie. I apologize. I'm sorry. I couldn't get off of mute for that question, and I apologize.
Oh, that's okay.
Hi, Dr. Raiford. This is Liz Gross. I have another question for you, switching over to the WASI II. My question is, what can I do if I can't use block design for the WASI II?
Sure, yeah. So we do have the WASI II available within the Q Global digital assets, and we do get this question a lot. So I'm gonna really, there's only one scenario to go through here, but it depends on the examinee's age. So obviously with a full administration, we can get a verbal comprehension index and a perceptual reasoning index, and either the full scale IQ 2 subtest or 4 subtest. But without block design, we have some ways to work around it so that you can still get a measure of reasoning that's based on visual input. But without block design, you wouldn't be able to do that within just the WASI. So the way to work around that is to rely on the WISC-V and the WAIS-IV. So for example, let's go through age 6 through 16. And with 16-year-olds, you have a choice. You can go either of these routes. But if you read down the first column there under examinee age 6 to 16, you can see you can still get a verbal comprehension index. That's not affected. But for the perceptual reasoning index, you would convert the WASI II matrix reasoning to a scaled score using WASI II table A2. And the good thing about the WASI is it's already built to be substituted into those larger batteries. So there are technical reports that are available to support this practice, and those are available on the WASI II Pearson page. Because we knew that often people want to screen with the WASI II, and then they may want to do additional testing depending on their results. So best practice is not to re-administer those 4 subtests from the WASI when you get to the larger measure, to the more comprehensive measure, but it's really to take those T-scores and convert them to scaled scores and then substitute them in place of the other subtest, the parallel subtest on the larger measure. So this is already a practice that's supported. So you would convert the WASI II matrix reasoning to a scaled score using that WASI II table A2 that's in the manual, and then administer WISC-V figure weights and sum the WASI II matrix reasoning and WISC-V figure weights scaled scores, and then convert that sum of scaled scores to the WISC-V fluid reasoning index. And you're using, at this point, WISC-V table A4 in the administration and scoring manual. In this situation, you can still get a full scale IQ 2 subtest, but not a 4 subtest. And the reason being that there is no substitution available on the WASI because it's just 4 subtests. So if a larger full scale IQ was needed, you could go on and administer the rest of the WISC-V subtests that were necessary. Now let's go through the 16 to 90-year-olds. It's a similar situation with the verbal comprehension index on the WASI. You've already got that, and you can still get a full scale IQ 2 subtest. But for the perceptual reasoning index, after you convert that WASI II matrix reasoning to a scaled score, then you would be administering the WAIS-IV visual puzzles and either picture completion or figure weights. You can take your pick. If the person is 70 or older, it'll have to be picture completion because figure weights is not available over age 69. And then sum the WASI II matrix reasoning and the WAIS-IV visual puzzles and WAIS-IV either picture completion or figure weights scaled scores, and convert that sum of scaled scores to the WAIS-IV perceptual reasoning index using WAIS-IV table A4. So I hope that helped and made it clear.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Thank you. And then what materials would I need to do this?
So in order to do this, you need the WASI II digital STEM book, the WASI II record form, and the WASI II manual. The manual is also available digitally if you don't happen to have the paper copy or you don't have access to it. And then if the examinee's age 6 to 16 and you're going with the WISC, you would need the WISC administration and scoring manual, the digital stimulus book for those subtests that you're using for figure weights, and the record form for figure weights. And then if it's an examinee age 16 to 90, you need the WAIS-IV administration and scoring manual, which is available digitally, or you can use your paper copy if you have it, and the digital stimulus book and the record form. Does that help answer that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. This is all really great information. We have a lot of questions coming in, and but before we get to any of the Q&A, I was wondering if you could talk with us about what validity evidence there is for the scores that you can obtain with the remote administration. That we are getting a lot of questions about that.
Sure. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm happy to address that. So when you're considering teleassessment, it's important to conduct a demands analysis of each task you'll be using. So you can then look at what evidence is available that supports tasks like the one you're considering using, or the same task that you're using. Pearson has done this work for customers on the measures that we support right now for teleassessment. And I'm going to walk you through that process. Table 2 in the online guidance is where we've done this. So you can go to any measure, the Telepractice guidance for that measure, and look at Table 2. And I'm going to walk you through this process. So as you're thinking about the measures you're going to be using, the first step is to think about the input and the output demands in the processing. The input and output demands are the most critical here in a teleassessment situation. Input being how is information received, and the output being how is a response provided. In terms of processing, these shouldn't be different in teleassessment if teleassessment is done properly. And that's what that guidance is there for, to help you think about how to keep the processing demands the same. And it's rather long to read through those, but it's really important. So with processing, we think about what abilities are needed to process the information. Really, for teleassessment, it's important to pre-screen for the appropriateness of the examinee and the environment, and try to remove technology as a barrier and secure agreement about the environment's conditions and monitor those. Otherwise, it should be the same as or similar to face-to-face. And then monitor your technology issues if anything arises, that like Maggie had trouble getting off mute. So that could be a problem if you're trying to do teleassessment. And little things like that can come up, or glitches in your connectivity. And as you do that, you make the decisions to interpret or not interpret your scores accordingly, or with greater caution. We also ask for processing what pre-existing knowledge is necessary. And if you check out the guidance for our measures, we don't want, in a situation where the examinees being assessed by teleassessment, for them to have access to different pre-existing knowledge for a task than they usually would. So the key there is to ensure that examinees close all programs and don't have anything else running except the teleconference software. And otherwise, this should be the same as face-to-face. But if they have a dictionary open on their screen, that's a problem if they're taking a vocabulary task, because they can look things up. So that's one way of thinking about, how do you keep the processing demands the same in terms of pre-existing knowledge. Also, are there strategies involved in processing the information or formulating a response? One common, strategy that would be different in a teleassessment situation that would be problematic is if they're writing down digits as you're saying them. So note-taking or allowing others in the room helping out as a strategy, you can't allow any more than you would in a face-to-face session. Another strategy that could be problematic is opening up materials in advance of the session and looking at them and getting familiar with the tasks, which is a problem. So that's why we recommend response booklets be sealed in an envelope with your signature on the back and be opened on camera at the time that the examiner prompts the person to do it, the examinee, sorry. So I'm going to go through an example of how to analyze the input and output and processing demands, and then how we can use that to apply the evidence that exists for teleassessment right now. So this is an arithmetic item. This is not a real item, but it's a verbally presented item. So I would read this to the examinee. I would say, Bill has 3 masks and 2 children. How many masks are left over if each child wears 1? So then I'm going to do my arithmetic information processing analysis. I'm going to go through these different steps. So first, I think about the task. And the task is that the child solves arithmetic word problems read aloud and provides a verbal response. The input is spoken by the examiner, and so the examinee is receiving auditory input and attention and concentration are involved during the input. The processing involves auditory processing, working memory, processing speed, math fluency, math problem solving, and math computation. There's a lot going on there. And then the output is brief expressive responses. So let's look at how we apply this information. I don't have arithmetic on this slide, but this is an example of what we do once we've analyzed those input and output demands in Table 2 when we provide that guidance. So if you look in the first column there, you can see it says WISC-V subtests. So we're going to use those as an example. And there's a link to the WISC-V Telepractice guidance there at the top, but you can go to any test that's available with those digital assets and access the same type of information for every test. So this table here is going to match whatever those demands are with the evidence that we have for teleassessment and teleassessment equivalence between teleassessment and face-to-face assessment, and then also the evidence for similar tasks. So if you read to the right, let's do an example here. Similarities, you can see that it says there the input is BD and SS. BD is just an abbreviation for brief spoken directions. And then SS is spoken stimuli. And then the output column is next there. And you can see it's for similarities. It says OE and SPR. OE is an open-ended response, and SPR is a spoken response. The fourth column there that says direct evidence, you can see there's two headers. One says T and one says D. The T are the studies that have looked at this particular task for equivalence. And it's 7, 8, and 11. There's a list of teleassessment equivalent studies that appears in the references at the end of the telepractice guidance for any measure. So they're numbered. We just numbered them so we didn't have to repeat the author's name every time. The telepractice studies are the one next to T, and D, those are studies that have been conducted on Q Interactive. We decided to include those in case people wanted to reference those equivalent studies as well, because Q Interactive is one method of delivery for teleassessment. And also, although they weren't conducted remotely, they do involve technology. So they're not as directly applicable, but we just provided the information in case people want it. And then in the far right column there, evidence for similar tasks. We've cited a number of tasks that have similar input and output demands that have also been studied for equivalence, and that we've seen have evidence of some equivalence in those populations that were studied. So then what you would need to do as you're applying that evidence is look at, does the evidence indicate score equivalence across modes? So what you're asking is, on average, would a person obtain the same score with either mode? And if the answer is yes, that probably oversimplifies that evaluation process. But if it is, you can use the same norms. And then you have to think about just review that prior research or existing evidence on the type of the administration change being considered. Right now, during COVID, a lot of people are in the situation where they've got to rely on teleassessment to keep people safe. And so fortunately, the test standards cover this situation. Because really we're all of your examinees are individuals in special situations. Everybody is vulnerable to this virus. each of us as well as our examinees. And so the test standards tell us that we need to review prior evidence, if it exists, on the type of administration change we're considering as the test user. And if there is prior research that indicates no effect on scores for that type, probably more studies aren't necessary. We're not really in that situation right now where we have a lot of more studies that are needed. However, there are over 20, I think there's around 25 equivalent studies now, and that surprises most people. Most people think that there aren't equivalent studies available, or maybe there's only a couple. A number of those studies are done on clinical populations or with a mix and match, kind of a neuropsychological battery where you pull a few measures from a number of different places and look and see what the effects were for that particular clinical group. But there are some larger studies that have been conducted on non-clinical populations as well. Of course, there's a lot more studies that are needed, but if you use the guidance that's available from your professional organizations, APA has some excellent guidance about how to consider performance and introduce more caution into your interpretive approach. So, but it is helpful to think about, have there been any prior studies, and how can that inform my interpretation? And I think that may take us through all of our questions that we had in advance. And we have about, I guess, 17 minutes left.
Well, I have questions for you.
Great.
We're fielding a lot of questions, obviously, and I just want to make sure that everybody knows that someone will contact you in some way to try to answer a question that is not answered today. But I have a list of questions here that I want to ask you now, Susie. Someone is asking why the WISC isn't available. Most of the questions that I'm going to ask you will definitely focus on the content that you've been talking about already, but we have had a question about the WISC, and I thought that would be a good question for you to answer aloud, because I'm sure other people wonder also. Why is the WISC not available for remote testing at this time?
Well, we really focused on, we tried to focus on the school age and the adults because there are studies for those ages that are more extensive. However, for preschoolers, there's not a lot of data available. And the data that we have isn't super optimistic about the possibility of them being equivalent. And it's not that we've, completely ruled it out. We may provide it in the future, but we were focusing on making available those assessments that have at least been studied. There are a few studies, though, on preschoolers, and one of them actually found that there were 2 subtests that were speeded measures that were not equivalent. And so we ended up, or they ended up not including those subtests or not making them available for remote. But what was interesting is once the preschoolers were removed, then the analysis showed that there was equivalence for ages 7 and up. It was the 3 to 6-year-olds that were not equivalent. So certainly it could be done with additional caution, but we're focusing on the ones that we're more confident can be used, that there's more information about at this time. Does that help?
Yes,
I hope that answered it. Okay.
It's that elusive mute button. Thank you. So we have some questions about which materials the client needed again. And so I've put that back on I put that slide back on the screen to show the WISC-V materials.
Sure.
Hopefully that will help answer that. Got a question about, are there factor analysis results that show whether these subtests load on the on the indexes that you have mentioned in the alternate forms. And I know that we're not looking at that particular slide or any one particular slide, but I thought maybe a general discussion of the factor analysis results might be helpful.
Well, are they, I guess they must be talking about block design multiple choice and naming speed quantity. And I did not publish that, the factor analysis that I had with naming speed quantity having a higher loading. That was just an internal analysis. And then I believe there is a factor analysis that includes both the WISC and the WISC integrated, but I think it was the 4th edition.
Thank you.
And if we save that question, I could probably email that person directly.
Okay. All right, thank you. Are the confidence intervals much wider when these kinds of substitutions are made? For example, non-motor block design and full-scale IQ, GAI, et cetera.
These are not substitutions. These are independently calculated norms. They are not substitutions into the traditional scores. And I think that's something that people think a lot. They think that I'm just taking block design and substituting it. They aren't. These are composite norms that were calculated with those subtests that we've listed.
Thank you. I think that answered another question that also someone had. Subtest, substitution, and proration are not permitted for any index score. Doesn't that contradict what you're saying? I'm confused. And so I think you just answered that question as well. So thank you.
Right. It's not anymore. It's not substitution. It's at all. You can think about it this way. I believe most people are aware that we have an auditory working memory index that uses digit span and letter number sequencing on the WISC-V, but our primary index score, the working memory index, is based on digit span and picture span. Those are different norms. We did not use substitution and calculate the working memory index again to get an auditory working memory index. We actually normed those separately. In the same way, these alternate scores are norms. They are different norms, but they're based on the same data, but we don't use block design when we calculate the non-motor visual spatial index. We use the actual scores from block design multiple choice and create a new norm.
Thank you. I want to verbally answer. A lot of people are asking about very specific tests and how to administer very specific tests on remotely. And I just want to point people back to the guidance documents for each of the tests that we have recommended or that we support for remote testing. Those are on our Telepractice web pages. If you'll find the product tab, then you'll be able to find the specific product and pull up the guidance documents and read those. So for the next question, Susie, there's a question about what the thinking was when the WISC-V Integrated was proposed. So clearly that was prior to the COVID time. Why was the WISC-V Integrated proposed utilizing a non-motor component and domain scores? Is there a plan to test remotely moving forward for all practitioners, being that it was made 3 years ago? Was there knowledge of our current situation? Did we anticipate a time when we might need to or want to do more remote testing, I think is the broad question.
Okay, so let's talk about the WISC-V Integrated. That was actually published in 2016. And no, we had no idea that there was going to be a pandemic and everybody would want to do teleassessment, of course. But one thing that the whole purpose of the WISC-V Integrated is to give additional information when a score is low in a particular area, or if you just want to get more information using alternate response processes, so or alternate inputs. So, for example, the WISC-V Integrated has multiple choice versions of all 4 of the verbal tasks, and you can go on and give those to find out what the child can demonstrate in terms of their performance without having to have expressive demands. So there's a comprehension multiple choice, an information multiple choice, a vocabulary multiple choice, and those responses are read to the child. And there's there's an option of 4 or 5 responses on every page. The child just chooses the best answer, and there are 2-point, 1-point, and 0-point responses that match what's in the regular WISC-V in your scoring criteria. And that can give you additional information about the child's abilities without having that particular expressive demand. So there are all types of subtests on the integrated that can be used to expand on your WISC-V results. And there are only 2 composite scores in that test. It's really based on the process approach to cognitive assessment, where you can, all of us pretty much were trained to test limits and maybe use alternative procedures to get more information after testing is over. This is based on a similar premise. So block design multiple choice was created because there are children that have problems with motor demands. And so with block design multiple choice, you're merely looking at a picture at the top of the page, and then there's 4 options that show blocks pulled apart that when you push them together, you choose the one that would make the completed design at the top of the page. So it's the same type of cognitive process, but it eliminates the motor demands. So on the WISC-V Integrated, there's a visual working memory index. You can take your picture span subtest from the WISC-V, that score, and then sum it with the scaled score for spatial span, which is it's a block tapping kind of task. And then you can get a visual working memory index. And then there's also a multiple choice verbal comprehension index that's available. It can be compared with the VCI, and it's non-expressive. But we didn't include a lot of composite scores. But then when I was writing essentials of WISC-V integrated assessment, I was able to do what I wanted to do to support customers who had written in over the years. And I have run into situations where there were some people who couldn't use the traditional scores for various reasons, or there was a reason why they wanted to use something that didn't involve motor demands because they had a question about performance. And so I just created those for those people. So I'd have some place to refer them. And I created a whole bunch of non-expressive composites for the same reason. And they closely mirror those WISC-V composites. So there's a lot more in that book than just the scores that I've talked about. But that was the purpose behind those. We had never really included composite scores like that before. It was just as I was thinking about the best way to support test users, I wanted to provide that. And myself, having been a clinician for a long time, I've run into those situations too. So I just thought it would be useful.
Thank you. Another question related to WISC-V Integrated. Multiple choice versus open-ended verbal responses provide more memory cueing, which can affect an examinee's recall ability. How is that factored into interpretation?
Can you repeat that? I'm not sure I'm understanding the multiple choice
versus open-ended verbal responses provide more memory cueing, which can affect an examinee's recall ability. I guess just how are you interpreting differently what is the task demands of multiple choice versus open-ended?
Sure. Well, I just want to make it clear, first of all, that those tasks are all also normed separately. It's co-normed with the WISC-V, but they're not normed based on the expressive demands. These tasks are independently normed based on the sample's performance on those tasks. So the interpretation chapter of that WISC-V Integrated Technical and Interpretive Manual is very extensive. And we talk about there are different demands that are introduced and there are other demands that are minimized, it doesn't mean it makes it easier. It's just different. But it's a method of hypothesis test. It's a method for hypothesis testing. So there's a lot to unpack there. And I hope that you'll be able to, whoever asked that question, that you'll be able to take a look at the WISC-V Integrated Technical and Interpretive Manual chapter. The book also has some information about that. I was only able to make certain portions of the book available, but I go through interpretive processes on, or interpretive hypotheses on every subtest and different interpretive statements, and discuss the different demands on the different types of subtests. So it's definitely not assumed that you would interpret it the same way.
Thank you. Another one that I think would be helpful for everybody to hear your response to is, when thinking about writing reports based on these kinds of subtest changes, how would you talk about the reliability, validity issue?
In the book, the free book that's available, all of that information is available in there. There's reliability, validity, clinical utility, and interpretive statements. So I would use the book that's available for free.
Thank you. Someone is asking if they can apply what we've talked about today to use with the WISC-V Spanish. And it made me wonder if we have a WISC-V Spanish guidance document. I haven't had a chance to go check, but I thought maybe you could address the overall question.
Yes, so really this webinar didn't focus on that. I apologize, but if we want to respond to that person or anybody that's interested in that after the webinar, that'd be fine with me.
Okay, we'll do that after. We'll get back with you. Yeah. One more question that may require going back to a previous slide, but then I think we'll need to close out because we're almost at the top of the hour. Why would you be able to get a full scale on the WASI II and not on the WISC-V or WAIS-IV?
Okay, so you can get a full scale on the WASI II, but it is, let me get to the right slide here. It's at the end. Oh, you may have been on the right one. Sorry about that. It's the full scale IQ 2. So there are two subtests that don't involve block design that are involved in calculating that full scale IQ 2. It's matrix reasoning and vocabulary. Block design isn't used in the full scale IQ 2.
There you go. Thank you very much. I think that was all the questions that I had tagged to ask you. We, of course, as I mentioned earlier, have a lot of questions that we were unable to get to, or some that weren't directly related to today's content. So someone will reach out to you with a response to those questions, and we have a couple that Dr. Raiford will answer directly. So thank you all very much for attending today. Thank you to our panel members. Hope that this has been helpful for you all. Please go to our Telepractice web pages at pearsonassessments.com. Search for the Telepractice pages and then the specific instruments to find specific guidance on administering these instruments remotely. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.